any of
or
the
intended to be
provisions of
used to
Section
commit the offense.
215 of this title shall,
Schemes to commit
upon
identity
conviction
theft or
thereof, be
fraud
subject
may
to a
also
fine
involve
of not more than
violations of other
$10,000,
statutes such as
or to the
identification
imprisonment
fraud,
for not
credit
more than
card
6
fraud,
months, or
computer
both.
fraud,
No
mail
person
fraud,
shall be
wire
imprisoned
fraud,
under this
or
subsection,
financial institution
except
fraud.
for an offense committed
Here,
after
an
the
examination
conviction of
of
such
Claudia
person
Gale,
for a prior
assumed
offense
identity,
under this
discrepancies,
subsection.
and
Employers
alleged
who
fraudulent
improperly
activities are
classified
discussed.
nurses as independent
In a
contractors,
perplexing turn
and
of
as a
events,
result,
evidence suggests
employers
that
failed and
Claudia
refused
Gale
to pay
may
their
not actually
employer's
exist
share
as an
of the
authentic
Federal Insurance
individual.
Contribution Act,
Her purported
FICA,
affiliation with
taxes on
Harry's
each
Nurses
nurse's gross
Registry
wages,
Incorporated,
and
starting on
accordingly
February
plaintiffs were
20,
required to pay the
2007,
same.
is
By
riddled with
employers' failure and
inconsistencies.
refusal to pay their
An
employer's share
affidavit
of
provided
FICA
by
on
Mr.
behalf
Michael
of
Morgan
nurses,
raises
employers were
significant doubts about
unjustly
the legitimacy
enriched.
of
By
Claudia's
employers'
identity.
failure and refusal to pay
Several
their
points of
employer's
contention
share of
arise.
FICA on behalf of nurses, and
Discrepancies in
failure and
personal
refusal to pay
information,
nurses
Claudia's
for travel
professional
time
nursing
between
certificate
consecutive
lists and
assignments,
address in
they
Kingston,
exercised
Jamaica,
dominion
West
over and
Indies.
appropriated such funds
This
for
raises
their own
questions
use and
about the
benefit,
veracity of her
thereby
presence in the
depriving
U.S.
nurses of the rights and benefits
Furthermore,
thereto.
her inconsistent
Accordingly,
signatures
employers
across
are
various
guilty of
documents
conversion.
only deepen these
As a proximate
suspicions.
result of employers' conduct,
Document
as
submission
alleged
timing.
herein,
An oddity
nurses suffer
exists in the
damages and are
timeline of her
entitled to an
affiliation with
award of
Harry's Nurses
compensatory
Registry
and
Incorporated.
consequential damages.
The date she
All other
reportedly started
similarly
work aligns
situated
exactly
employees
with
are
the day
also
her
entitled
documents
to
were
damages
faxed,
in the form of
signaling a potential
uncompensated
discrepancy.
overtime wages, liquidated
Suspicious
damages,
recommendation, a
attorneys'
recommendation
fees,
letter
and
on
other,
behalf of
so as
submitted
to
by
preclude
P. Plans
employers'
from White
unjust
Globe
enrichment.
Placement Incorporated.
Pursuant to
P.
and
Plans'
filed with
primary
this
profession
complaint
as
as
a lawyer,
exhibits A
which
through
suggests
late
that
the
Claudia's
consent to become
placement at
party
H&R
nurses
may have been a
executed by
strategic
each
move,
nurse.
possibly aiming
According to
for a
the Fair Labor
premeditated
Standard
lawsuit
Act
against the registry.
1938, a lawsuit shall be
Social
brought against
Security
employers under
concerns.
the FLSA
Claudia's
Act.
Social Security
However,
number,
per requirements are set in order to
125-82
enforce Section 29
XXXX,
USC
appears to belong to a
216B.
deceased individual,
The section
May White
provides a
Show,
clear direction
born
to
on
the parties
February
involved
1,
in the enforcement of
1945.
216B.
This
Any employer
implies
who
potential
violates the provisions
SSN
of
fraud.
Section 206 or Section
Multiple
207 of this
identities.
title
Claudia
shall be liable
appears
to
to
the
operate
employee
under
or
multiple
employees
names across
affected in
various
the amount
states.
of their unpaid minimum wages
Names
or
such as
their
Claudia
unpaid
Gale,
overtime
Claudia
compensation,
Mathias,
as the case may
and
be,
Claudia
and in
Williams
additional
have been
equal
associated
amount as
with her.
liquidated damages. The condition
Intriguingly,
pursues
she seems to have replicated the identity of Williams Claudia Cecile, a relative of Sherilyn Williams, a former RN of Harry's home care. This assumed identity even extends to duplicating a license number. Such deceptive tactics suggest a well-orchestrated scheme, potentially facilitated by a private attorney, Mr. Jonathan Bernstein. Interstate activities. Claudia's alleged residences span 5 states: Florida, Georgia, New York, Maryland, and South Carolina. Given that she lacks valid identification, it's plausible that she has assumed someone else's identity. Furthermore, her lack of New York State residency suggests she doesn't possess legitimate citizenship papers. Other alarming indicators: Claudia's multiple IDs, several phone numbers, overlapping residences, and multiple bankruptcy filings, 5 times, which is inconsistent with the legal restriction of 1 filing per 10 years, all paint a picture of elaborate fraudulent endeavors. A letter from attorney Jonathan Bernstein seems to corroborate these findings, acknowledging that all documentation from Claudia Gale was indeed counterfeit. In essence, this intricate web of discrepancies, assumed identities, and potential fraudulent activities positions Claudia Gale as a notable figure in a seemingly elaborate scheme, with possible collaborations involving private legal entities. It underscores the significance of thorough background checks and verification processes, especially when engaging in professional relationships.
Employers who improperly classified nurses as independent contractors, and as a result, employers failed and refused to pay their
Identity theft and
employer
identity
share
fraud
of the
are
Federal
terms
Insurance
used to refer to all
Contribution
types of
Act,
crime
FICA,
in which someone
taxes on
wrongfully
each nurse's
obtains
gross
and uses
wages,
another person's
and
personal
accordingly,
data in
plaintiffs
some way
were
that
required
involves
to pay
fraud
the
or
same.
deception,
By
typically for
employers'
economic
failure and
gain.
refusal to pay their
What's the
employer's share of
Department of
FICA
Justice
on
doing
behalf
about
of
identity
nurses,
theft and
employers
fraud?
were unjustly
The
enriched.
Department of
By
Justice
employers'
prosecutes
failure and
cases of
refusal to
identity
pay their
theft and
employer's
fraud
share
under a
of
variety
FICA
of federal
on behalf of
statutes.
nurses and failure and
In the
refusal
fall
to
of
pay nurses for
1998,
travel
for
time
example,
between consecutive
Congress
assignments,
passed the Identity
they
Theft and
exercised
Assumption
dominion
Deterrence
over
Act.
and appropriated such
This
funds for their
legislation
own use
created a
and
new
benefit,
offense of identity
thereby
theft,
depriving
which
nurses of the
prohibits
rights and
knowingly
benefits
transferring
thereto.
or using,
Accordingly,
without lawful
employers are
authority,
guilty
a means
of
of
conversion.
identification of
As
another
approximate
person with
result
the
of
intent to
employer's
commit or
conduct,
to aid
as
or
alleged
abet
herein,
any unlawful
nurses suffer
activity that
damages and are
constitutes a
entitled to
violation
an
of
award of
federal law or
compensatory
that
and
constitutes a
consequential
felony under
damages.
any applicable
All
state
other
or local
similarly
law.
situated employees
This
are also
offense,
entitled
in
to
most
damages in the
circumstances,
form of
carries a maximum
uncompensated
term of
overtime
15
wages,
years
liquidated
imprisonment, a
damages,
fine,
attorneys'
and criminal
fees, and
forfeiture of
other
any personal property
damages
used
so as
or
to
intended
preclude
to be used to
employers'
commit the
unjust
offense.
enrichment. Pursuant to
Schemes
Section
to commit identity
216b,
theft or
attached
fraud
hereto
may
and
also
filed
involve
with this
violations
complaint
of
as
other
exhibits A
statutes
through
such as
late, the
identification
consent to
fraud,
become party
credit card
nurses
fraud,
executed by
computer
each
fraud,
nurse.
mail fraud,
According to the Fair
wire
Labor
fraud,
Standard
or
Act
financial
1938,
institution
a
fraud.
lawsuit shall be brought against
Here,
employers
an examination
under the
of
FLSA
Claudia
Act.
Gale,
However,
assumed
per
identity,
requirements are set in order to
discrepancies,
enforce
and
Section
alleged
29
fraudulent activities
USC
are discussed.
216b.
In a
This section
perplexing
provides a
turn of
clear
events,
direction to the
evidence
parties involved
suggests
in the
that
enforcement of
Claudia Gale
216b.
may not actually
Any
exist as an
employer who
authentic
violates the
individual.
provisions of Section 206
Her purported
or Section
affiliation
207
with
of
Harry's
this title
Nurses
shall be
Registry
liable to the
Incorporated,
employee
starting
or
on
employees
February
affected
20th,
in the amount of their
2007,
unpaid minimum
is riddled
wages
with
or their
inconsistencies.
unpaid overtime compensation.
An
as the
affidavit
case may
provided by
be,
Mr.
and
Michael
in an
Morgan
additional
raises
equal amount
significant
as
doubts
liquidated
about the
damages.
legitimacy
The
of Claudia's
condition
identity.
pursues to find the violation
Several
prior to the
points of
enforcement,
contention
and
arise.
finding violation must be
Discrepancies
identified by
in
the
personal
Department of Labor,
information.
who is
Claudia's
responsible to
professional
conduct the
nursing
audits in
certificate
order to
lists
find
an address in
violations of
Kingston,
Section 29,
Jamaica,
USC
West Indies.
206, 207,
This raises
and
questions about the
255.
veracity
If
of
the
her
Department
presence
of
in the
Labor
U.S.
finds violations against any
Furthermore,
employers,
her
the
inconsistent
DOL can
signatures
move to
across
enforce
various
29
documents
USC
only deepen these
216b
suspicions.
to the Department of Justice.
Document submission timing.
After finding the
An
violation
oddity
against an
exists in the
employer by the
timeline of her
Department of
affiliation
Labor
with
shall
Harry's
send memos to
Nurses
each
Registry
worker involved
Incorporated.
in order to inform them
The
about
date she
the
reportedly
violation and
started
the
work
opportunity
aligns
to
exactly
enforce the
with the
said
day her
violation
documents were
against the
faxed,
employer. The
signaling a
letter shall
potential
instruct the
discrepancy.
workers to sign the consent
Suspicious
and take an oath that
recommendation.
shall be
A
authorized
recommendation
by the
letter on
court to
behalf of
enforce
Claudia
Section
was
18
submitted by
USC,
P. Glantz
Section
from White Globe
401
Placement
or 29
Incorporated.
USC Section
An
216.
internet search
The
reveals P.
Department of
Glantz's
Labor has to
primary
coordinate
profession
to
as a
comply
lawyer,
with the summons
which
and
suggests that
complaints and
Claudia's
cover
placement
sheet
at HNR may have been a
to file
strategic
it to the
move,
federal court
possibly
under
aiming
Section
for a
18
premeditated
USC,
lawsuit against the
Section
registry.
401 or 29
Social
USC
Security
Section
concerns.
216
Claudia's
to enforce
Social
the
Security number,
benefit under the federal law called
125-82
FICA.
XXXX,
Under the
appears to
Section
belong to a
29
deceased
USC
individual, May White Chill,
216A,
born on
any
February
person who
1st,
willfully violates
1945.
any of the provisions of
This
Section
implies
215
potential
of this
SSN
title
fraud.
shall, upon
Multiple
conviction thereof,
identities.
be subject
Claudia
to a fine
appears
of
to
not more than
operate under multiple
$10,000
names across
or to the
various states.
imprisonment for not more than
Names
6
such
months,
as
or
Claudia
both.
Gale,
No
Claudia
person shall be
Mathias,
imprisoned
and
under this
Claudia
subsection,
Williams have been
except for an
associated with her.
offense committed after the conviction of
Intriguingly,
such
she seems to
person
have
for a
replicated the
prior
identity
offense under
of
this
Williams
subsection.
Claudia Cecile,
Employers
a
who
relative of
improperly
Sherilyn
classified
Williams, a
nurses
former
as
RN of
independent
Harry's Home Care.
contractors, and as a result,
This assumed
employers
identity
failed
even
and
extends
refused
to
pay their
duplicating a license
employer's
number.
share of the Federal Insurance
Such
Contribution
deceptive
Act,
tactics suggest
FICA,
a well-orchestrated
taxes on each
scheme,
nurse's
potentially
gross wages,
facilitated
and
by a private
accordingly
attorney,
plaintiffs were
Mr. Jonathan
required to pay the
Bernstein.
same. By
Interstate
employers' failure and
activities.
refusal
Claudia's
to pay their
alleged
employer's share of
residences span
FICA on
5
behalf
states,
of nurses,
Florida,
employers
Georgia,
were unjustly
New York,
enriched.
Maryland,
By
and South
employers'
Carolina.
failure and refusal to pay their
Given that she
employer's
lacks
share
valid
of FICA
identification,
on behalf
it's
of nurses
plausible
and
that she
failure
has
and
assumed
refusal to
someone
pay
else's
nurses
identity.
for travel time between
Furthermore,
consecutive
her
assignments,
lack of New
they
York State
exercised
residency
dominion
suggests
over
she
and
doesn't
appropriated
possess
such
legitimate
funds for
citizenship
their own
papers.
use and benefit,
Other
thereby
alarming
depriving
indicators,
nurses of the rights
Claudia's
and benefits
multiple
thereto.
IDs, several
Accordingly,
phone numbers,
employers are
overlapping
guilty of
residences,
conversion.
and multiple
As a
bankruptcy
proximate
filings,
result of employers'
5
conduct,
times, to be
as alleged
precise,
herein,
which is
nurses
inconsistent
suffer
with the legal
damages and are
restriction of
entitled
one
to an
filing per
award of
10 years.
compensatory
All
and
paint a picture
consequential
of elaborate
damages.
fraudulent endeavors.
All other similarly
A letter from
situated
attorney
employees
Jonathan
are also
Bernstein
entitled to
seems to
damages in the
corroborate these
form of
findings,
uncompensated
acknowledging
overtime
that all
wages,
documentation
liquidated
from Claudia
damages,
Gale was
attorneys'
indeed
fees,
counterfeit.
and other
In
damages
essence,
so as
this
to
intricate
preclude
web of
employers'
discrepancies,
unjust enrichment.
assumed identities,
Pursuant to
and
Section
potential fraudulent
216b,
activities
attached
positions
hereto and
Claudia
filed
Gale
with this
as a
complaint as
notable figure
exhibits
in a
A through
seemingly
late,
elaborate
the
scheme
consent to
with
become
possible
party nurses
collaborations
executed by
involving
each
private
nurse.
legal entities.
According to the Fair Labor
It
Standard
underscores
Act
the significance of
1938,
thorough
a lawsuit
background
shall be
checks
brought
and
against
verification
employers under
processes,
FLSA
especially
Act.
when engaging
However,
in professional
requirements
relationships.
are set in order to enforce Section 29 U.S.C. 216b. The section provides a clear direction to the parties
Identity
involved in the
theft.
enforcement of 216b.
Identity theft and
Any
identity
employer
fraud
who
are
violates
terms
the
used to
provisions of
refer to
Section
all types of
206
crime
or
in
Section
which someone
207 of
wrongfully
this title shall
obtains
be
and uses
liable
another
to the
person's
employee
personal
or
data in
employees
some way
affected
that
in the
involves
amount of their
fraud or
unpaid
deception,
minimum wages,
typically
or
for
their
economic
unpaid
gain.
overtime compensation,
What's the
as the
Department of
case may
Justice
be,
doing
and
about
in an
identity
additional
theft
equal
and fraud?
amount as liquidated
The
damages.
Department
The
of Justice
condition
prosecutes
pursues to find
cases
a
of
violation
identity
prior
theft
to the
and fraud
enforcement,
under a
and
variety
finding
of federal
violation must be
statutes.
identified by the Department
In the
of
fall
Labor,
of
who is
1998, for example, Congress passed the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. This legislation created a new offense of identity theft, which prohibits knowingly transferring or using, without lawful authority, a means of identification of another person with the intent to commit or to aid or abet any unlawful activity that constitutes a violation of federal law, or that constitutes a felony under any applicable state or local law. This offense, in most circumstances, carries a maximum term of 15 years imprisonment, a fine, and criminal forfeiture of any personal property used or intended to be used to commit the offense. Schemes to commit identity theft or fraud may also involve violations of other statutes such as identification fraud, credit card fraud, computer fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, or financial institution fraud. Here, an examination of Claudia Gale, assumed identity, discrepancies, and alleged fraudulent activities are discussed. In a perplexing turn of events, evidence suggests that Claudia Gale may not actually exist as an authentic individual. Her purported affiliation with Harry's Nurses Registry Incorporated, starting on February 20, 2007, is riddled with inconsistencies. An affidavit provided by Mr. Michael Morgan raises significant doubts about the legitimacy of Claudia's identity. Several points of contention arise. Discrepancies in personal information. Claudia's professional nursing certificate lists an address in Kingston, Jamaica, West Indies. This raises questions about the veracity of her presence in the U.S. Furthermore, her inconsistent signatures across various documents only deepen these suspicions. Document submission timing. An oddity exists in the timeline of her affiliation with Harry's Nurses Registry Incorporated. The date she reportedly started work aligns exactly with the day her documents were faxed, signaling a potential discrepancy. Suspicious recommendation. A recommendation letter on behalf of Claudia was submitted by P. Glanz from White Globe Placement Incorporated. An internet search reveals P. Glanz's primary profession as a lawyer, which suggests that Claudia's placement at HNR may have been a strategic move, possibly aiming for a premeditated lawsuit against the registry. Social Security concerns. Claudia's Social Security number, 125-82XXXX, appears to belong to a deceased individual, May White Show, born on February 1, 1945. This implies potential SSN fraud. Multiple identities. Claudia appears to operate under multiple names across various states. Names such as Claudia Gale, Claudia Mathias, and Claudia Williams have been associated with her. Intriguingly, she seems to have replicated the identity of Williams Claudia Cecile, a relative of Sherilyn Williams, a former RN of Harry's Home Care. This assumed identity even extends to duplicating a license number. Such deceptive tactics suggest a well-orchestrated scheme, potentially facilitated by a private attorney, Mr. Jonathan Bernstein. Interstate activities. Claudia's alleged residences span 5 states: Florida, Georgia, New York, Maryland, and South Carolina. Given that she lacks valid identification, it's plausible that she has assumed someone else's identity. Furthermore, her lack of New York State residency suggests she doesn't possess legitimate citizenship papers. Other alarming indicators: Claudia's multiple IDs, several phone numbers, overlapping residences, and multiple bankruptcy filings, 5 times, to be precise, which is inconsistent with the legal restriction of 1 filing for 10 years, all paint a picture of elaborate fraudulent endeavors. A letter from attorney Jonathan Bernstein seems to corroborate these findings, acknowledging that all documentation from Claudia Gale was indeed counterfeit. In essence, this intricate web of discrepancies, assumed identities, and potential fraudulent activities positions Claudia Gale as a notable figure in a seemingly elaborate scheme, with possible collaborations involving private legal entities. It underscores the significance of thorough background checks and verification processes, especially when engaging in professional relationships.
Under the Section 29 U.S.C. 216A, any person who willfully violates any
identity
of the
theft and identity fraud are terms used to refer to all types of crime in which someone wrongfully obtains and uses another person's personal data in some way that involves fraud or deception, typically for economic gain.
No person
What's the
shall be
Department of
imprisoned
Justice
under
doing
this
about
subsection
identity theft and
except
fraud?
for an offense
The
committed
Department
after
of Justice
the conviction of
prosecutes
such
cases
person
of
for a
identity
prior
theft and
offense
fraud
this
under a
subsection.
variety of federal
Employers
statutes.
who improperly
In the
classified
fall of
nurses as
1998,
independent
for
contractors,
example,
and as a
Congress
result,
passed the Identity
employers
Theft and
failed and
Assumption
refused to
Deterrence
pay
Act.
their employer's share
This
of the Federal
legislation
Insurance
created a new
Contribution
offense of
Act,
identity
FICA,
theft, which
taxes on
prohibits
each nurse's
knowingly
gross
transferring
wages,
or using,
and accordingly
without lawful
plaintiffs were
authority, a
required
means
to
of
pay the same.
identification of
By
another person
employers'
with the
failure and
intent to
refusal
commit
to
or
pay
to
their
aid or
employer's share
abet
of
any
FICA on behalf
unlawful
of
activity
nurses,
that constitutes a
employers were
violation of
unjustly
federal law,
enriched.
or that
By employers'
constitutes a
failure
felony
and
under
refusal
any
to pay their
applicable state or
employer's share
local law.
of FICA on behalf
This
of nurses
offense,
and
in
failure and
most
refusal to pay
circumstances,
nurses
carries
for
a
travel
maximum
time
term
between
of 15
consecutive
years
assignments,
imprisonment,
they
a fine,
exercise
and
dominion
criminal
over and
forfeiture of any
appropriated
personal
such funds
property
for
used
their
or
own use
intended
and
to be
benefit,
used to commit the
thereby
offense.
depriving nurses of the rights
Schemes
and
to
benefits
commit identity
thereto.
theft or fraud
Accordingly,
may also
employers are
involve
guilty of
violations of other
conversion.
statutes
As a
such as
proximate result of
identification
employers'
fraud,
conduct,
credit card
as
fraud,
alleged
computer
herein,
fraud,
nurses
mail
suffer
fraud,
damages and are
wire
entitled
fraud,
to an
or
award of
financial institution
compensatory
fraud.
and consequential damages.
Here, an
All
examination
other
of
similarly
Claudia Gale,
situated
assumed
employees
identity,
are also entitled to
discrepancies,
damages in
and
the form
alleged
of
fraudulent
uncompensated
activities are
overtime
discussed.
wages, liquidated
In a
damages,
perplexing turn of
attorneys'
events,
fees,
evidence
and other
suggests that Claudia
damages
Gale
so as
may
to
not
preclude
actually
employers'
exist as an
unjust
authentic
enrichment.
individual.
Pursuant to
Her
Section
purported
216b,
affiliation with Harry's
attached
Nurses
hereto and
Registry
filed with this
Incorporated,
complaint as
starting on
exhibits
February
A through
20,
late, the consent to
2007,
become
is
party
riddled
nurses
with
executed by
inconsistencies.
each nurse.
An
According to the
affidavit
Fair
provided
Labor
by
Standard
Mr.
Act
Michael Morgan
1938,
raises
a
significant
lawsuit
doubts
shall be
about the
brought against
legitimacy of
employers
Claudia's
under the
identity.
FLSA Act.
Several
However, per
points of
requirements are
contention
set in order
arise.
to enforce Section 29
Discrepancies in
USC
personal information.
216b.
Claudia's
The
professional
section
nursing
provides a clear
certificate
direction
lists
to
an
the
address
parties
in
involved in the
Kingston,
enforcement of
Jamaica,
216b.
West Indies.
Any employer
This
who violates
raises
the
questions
provisions
about
of
the
Section
veracity of her
206
presence
or
in the
Section
U.S.
207 of this title shall be
Furthermore,
liable to the
her
employee
inconsistent
or
signatures
employees
across
affected in the
various
amount of their
documents
unpaid
only
minimum
deepen these
wages,
suspicions.
or their unpaid overtime
Document
compensation,
submission
as the
timing.
case may
An
be,
oddity
and
exists in the
additional
timeline
equal
of her
amount as
affiliation
liquidated
with Harry's
damages.
Nurses
The
Registry
condition
Incorporated.
pursues to find the violation
The
prior
date she
to the
reportedly
enforcement,
started work
and finding
aligns
violation
exactly
must
with
be
the day her
identified by the
documents were
Department of
faxed,
Labor, who
signaling
is
a potential
responsible to conduct
discrepancy.
the audits in order to find
Suspicious
violations of Section
recommendation.
29
A recommendation
USC
letter on
206,
behalf of Claudia was
207,
submitted
and
by P.
255.
Glanz from
If the
White
Department
Globe
of Labor
Placement
finds
Incorporated.
violations against any
An
employers,
internet search
the DOL
reveals
can
P.
move to
Glanz's
enforce
primary
29
profession as a
USC
lawyer,
216b
which suggests that
to the
Claudia's
Department of
placement at
Justice.
H&R may have been a
After finding the
strategic
violation
move,
against
possibly
an employer
aiming
by
for
the
a
Department of
premeditated
Labor shall
lawsuit
send
against the
memos to each
registry.
worker involved in order to
Social
inform
Security
them about
concerns.
the violation
Claudia's
and the
Social
opportunity
Security
to
number,
enforce the said violation against the employer.
125-82
The letter shall
XXXX,
instruct
appears
the
to
workers
belong
to
to a
sign the
deceased
consent
individual,
and take an
May
oath
White
that shall be
Show,
authorized
born on
by the
February
court
1,
to enforce
1945.
Section 18 USC,
This
Section
implies
401,
potential
or
SSN
29
fraud.
USC, Section 216.
Multiple identities.
The Department
Claudia
of Labor
appears
has
to
to
operate
coordinate
under
to comply
multiple
with the
names
summons
across
and
various
complaints and
states.
cover sheet JS
Names
44
such as
to file
Claudia
it to the
Gale,
federal court
Claudia
under Section
Mathias,
18
and
USC,
Claudia Williams
Section
have been
401
associated
or
with her.
29 USC, Section 216
Intriguingly, she
to
seems to have
enforce the Social
replicated the
Security
identity
benefit
of
under
Williams
the federal
Claudia
law called
Cecile,
FICA.
a relative
Under
of
the
Sherilyn
Section
Williams,
29
a former
USC
RN of Harry's Home Care.
216A, any
This
person
assumed
who
identity
willfully
even
violates
extends to
any of the
duplicating a
provisions
license
of
number.
Section 215 of
Such
this title
deceptive
shall,
tactics
upon
suggest a
conviction
well-orchestrated
thereof, be
scheme,
subject to a
potentially
fine of not more
facilitated
than
by a private
$10,000,
attorney, Mr.
or to the
Jonathan Bernstein.
imprisonment for not more than
Interstate
6 months,
activities.
or both.
Claudia's
No person
alleged
shall be
residences
imprisoned
span
under
5
this
states,
subsection
Florida,
except
Georgia,
for an offense
New York,
committed after
Maryland,
the
and
conviction
South
of such
Carolina.
person for a prior
Given that
offense
she
under
lacks
this
valid
subsection.
identification,
Employers
it's
who
plausible that
improperly
she has assumed
classified
someone
nurses
else's
as
identity.
independent contractors,
Furthermore,
and as a result,
her lack of New York
employers
State
failed and
residency
refused to pay
suggests
their
she doesn't
employer's
possess
share
legitimate
of the Federal
citizenship
Insurance
papers.
Contribution Act,
Other
FICA,
alarming indicators,
taxes on each
Claudia's
nurse's gross
multiple
wages,
IDs,
and
several
accordingly
phone numbers,
plaintiffs were
overlapping
required to pay the
residences,
same.
and multiple
By
bankruptcy
employers'
filings,
failure and
5
refusal to pay
times,
their
to be
employer's share of
precise,
FICA
which is
on behalf of
inconsistent
nurses,
with the legal restriction
employers
of
were
one filing
unjustly
per 10 years.
enriched.
All
By
paint a
employers'
picture of
failure and
elaborate
refusal to
fraudulent
to pay their
endeavors.
employer's share of
A
FICA
letter from
on
Attorney
behalf of
Jonathan
nurses and
Bernstein
failure and
seems to
refusal to pay
corroborate these
nurses
findings,
for travel time
acknowledging
between
that all
consecutive
documentation
assignments.
from
They
Claudia Gale
exercised
was
dominion
indeed
over
counterfeit.
and appropriated such
In
funds for
essence,
their own
this
use
intricate
and
web of
benefit,
discrepancies,
thereby depriving
assumed
nurses of
identities,
the rights
and
and
potential
benefits
fraudulent
thereto.
activities
Accordingly,
positions
employers
Claudia
are
Gale
guilty
as a
of
notable
conversion.
figure in a
As a
seemingly
proximate
elaborate
result of
scheme
employers'
with possible
conduct, as
collaborations
alleged
involving
herein,
private
nurses
legal
suffer
entities.
damages and are entitled
It
to an
underscores
award
the
of
significance of
compensatory
thorough
and
background
consequential
checks and
damages.
verification
All
processes,
other similarly
especially when
situated
engaging in
employees
professional
are also
relationships.
entitled to damages in the form of uncompensated overtime wages, liquidated damages, attorney's fees, and
Identity
other
theft.
damages so as to
Identity
preclude
theft and identity
employers'
fraud
unjust
are terms
enrichment.
used to refer to
Pursuant
all
to
types
Section
of crime in
216b,
which someone wrongfully
attached
obtains
hereto
and
and
uses
filed
another
with this
person's
complaint
personal
as
data in
exhibits
some
A
way
through
that
late
involves
the
fraud or
consent to
deception,
become party
typically
nurses
for economic
executed by
gain.
each nurse.
What's the
According
Department
to the
of
Fair
Justice
Labor
doing
Standard
about
Act
identity theft and
1938,
fraud?
a lawsuit shall be
The
brought
Department of
against
Justice
employers under
prosecutes
the
cases
FLSA
of
Act.
identity
However,
theft
per
and fraud
requirements
under
are
a
set in
variety
order
of
to
federal
enforce Section
statutes.
29 USC
In the fall of
216b.
1998,
The
for
section
example,
provides a clear
Congress
direction to
passed the
parties
Identity
involved in
Theft
the
and
enforcement
Assumption
of
Deterrence Act.
216b. Any
This
employer
legislation
who violates the
created a
provisions
new
of Section
offense of identity
206
theft,
or Section
which
207 of
prohibits
this title
knowingly
shall be
transferring
liable
or
to the
using,
employee
without
or
lawful
employees
authority,
affected in the
a
amount
means of
their unpaid
identification
minimum
of another
wages,
person
or
with the
their
intent to
unpaid
commit
overtime
or to aid
compensation,
or
as
abet
the case
any
may be,
unlawful
and in an
activity that
additional
constitutes a
equal amount as
violation of
liquidated
federal law,
damages.
or
The
that
condition
constitutes a
pursues to
felony
find the
under any
violation
applicable
prior to the
state or
enforcement,
local law.
and finding violation
This
must be
offense,
identified by
in
the
most
Department of Labor,
circumstances,
who is
carries a
responsible to
maximum
conduct
term
the
of
audits
15
in order
years
to find
imprisonment,
violations of
a
Section
fine,
29
and criminal
USC
forfeiture of any
206,
personal property
207,
used or
and
intended to be
255.
used to commit
If the
the
Department
offense.
of Labor finds violations
Schemes to
against
commit
any
identity
employers,
theft or
the DOL
fraud
can
may
move
also
to
involve
enforce 29
violations of other
USC
statutes such as
216b
identification
to the Department
fraud,
of Justice.
credit card fraud,
After finding
computer
the violation
fraud,
against
mail
an
fraud,
employer by the
wire
Department of
fraud,
Labor
or
shall
financial
send memos to
institution
each worker
fraud.
involved in order to inform
Here,
them
an
about
examination
the
of
violation
Claudia
and the
Gale,
opportunity to
assumed
enforce the
identity,
said violation
discrepancies,
against the employer.
and alleged
The letter
fraudulent
shall
activities
instruct the
are
workers to
discussed.
sign the consent
In a
and take an
perplexing
oath that
turn
shall
of
be
events,
authorized
evidence
by the
suggests
court to
that
enforce
Claudia
Section
Gale
18
may not
USC,
actually exist as
Section
an authentic
401,
individual.
or 29 USC,
Her purported
Section
affiliation
216.
with Harry's
The
Nurses
Department of
Registry
Labor has to
Incorporated,
coordinate
starting
to
on
comply
February
with the summons
20,
and complaints and cover
2007,
sheet
is riddled with
JS44
inconsistencies.
to file it to the federal court
An
under
affidavit
Section
provided
18
by
USC,
Mr. Michael Morgan
Section
raises
401,
significant
or
doubts
29
about the
USC,
legitimacy
Section
of Claudia's
216,
identity.
to enforce the Social
Several
Security
points of
benefit
contention
under the federal
arise.
law called FICA.
Discrepancies
Under
in
the
personal
Section
information,
29 USC
Claudia's professional nursing
216A,
certificate lists an
any
address
person
in
who
Kingston,
willfully
Jamaica,
violates
West
any of the
Indies.
provisions of Section
This raises
215
questions
of this
about the
title
veracity
shall,
of her presence
upon
in the
conviction
U.S.
thereof, be subject to a
Furthermore,
fine of not
her
more than
inconsistent
$10,000,
signatures across
or to
various
the
documents
imprisonment
only
for
deepen
not more
these
than 6
suspicions.
months, or both.
Document
No
submission
person shall be
timing,
imprisoned
an
under
oddity
this
exists in the
subsection
timeline of
except
her
for an
affiliation
offense
with Harry's
committed
Nurses
after
Registry
the conviction of
Incorporated.
such person for a
The
prior
date she
offense
reportedly
under this
started work
subsection.
aligns exactly with
Employers
the day
who
her documents
improperly
were
classified
faxed,
nurses
signaling
as
a potential
independent
discrepancy.
contractors, and as a result,
Suspicious
employers
recommendation.
failed and
A
refused to
recommendation
pay their
letter on behalf
employer's
of
share
Claudia
of the
was
Federal
submitted by
Insurance
Pete
Contribution
Glanz from
Act,
White Globe
FICA,
Placement
taxes
Incorporated.
on each nurse's gross
An
wages,
internet search
and
reveals
accordingly,
Pete Glanz's
plaintiffs were
primary
required to
profession
pay
as a
the
lawyer,
same.
which
By
suggests that
employers'
Claudia's
failure and
placement
refusal
at
to pay their
H&R may have been a
employer's share of
strategic
FICA on
move,
behalf of
possibly
nurses,
aiming for a
employers were
premeditated lawsuit
unjustly
against the
enriched.
registry.
By employers' failure
Social
and
Security
refusal to pay their
concerns.
employer's
Claudia's
share
Social
of
Security
FICA
number
on behalf of nurses and failure and refusal to pay nurses for travel time
appears to
between
belong to a
consecutive
deceased
assignments,
individual,
they
Mae White
exercised
Schill,
dominion
born on
over
February
and
1st,
appropriated such funds for
1945.
their own use and benefit,
This implies
thereby
potential
depriving
SSN
nurses
fraud.
of the rights and benefits
Multiple
thereto.
identities.
Accordingly,
Claudia
employers
appears
are
to
guilty
operate
of
under
conversion.
multiple names
As
across
approximate
various
result
states.
of employers' conduct,
Names
as
such as
alleged
Claudia
herein,
Gale,
nurses
Claudia
suffer damages
Mathias,
and are
and
entitled to
Claudia
an award
Williams
of
have been
compensatory and
associated with her.
consequential damages.
Intriguingly,
All other
she seems to
similarly
have replicated
situated
the identity
employees are
of
also
Williams
entitled
Claudia
to damages
Cecile,
in the
a
form of
relative of Sherilyn
uncompensated
Williams,
overtime
a
wages,
former RN of
liquidated
Harry's Home Care.
damages, attorneys'
This
fees,
assumed
and other
identity even
damages
extends to
so as to
duplicating a
preclude
license number.
employers' unjust enrichment.
Such deceptive
Pursuant to
tactics
Section
suggest a
216b,
well-orchestrated
attached
scheme,
hereto and
potentially
filed with this
facilitated by a
complaint as
private attorney,
exhibits A
Mr.
through
Jonathan
late, the
Bernstein.
consent to become party nurses
Interstate
executed by
activities.
each nurse.
Claudia's alleged
According to the
residences
Fair
span
Labor
5
Standard
states,
Act
Florida,
1938,
Georgia,
a lawsuit
New
shall
York,
be brought against
Maryland,
employers
and
under
South
the
Carolina.
FLSA Act. However,
Given that
per
she lacks
requirements are set
valid
in order to
identification,
enforce Section
it's
29
plausible that she has
USC
assumed someone else's
216b.
identity.
The section provides a clear
Furthermore,
direction
her
to the
lack of
parties
New York
involved in the
state
enforcement
residency
of
suggests
216b.
she doesn't possess
Any
legitimate
employer who
citizenship
violates the
papers.
provisions of Section 206
Other alarming
or Section
indicators,
207 of this
Claudia's
title shall be
multiple
liable
IDs,
to the
several
employee
phone
or
numbers,
employees employees
overlapping
affected in the amount of
residences,
their unpaid
and multiple
minimum
bankruptcy
wages, or
filings,
their unpaid
5
overtime
times, to be
compensation,
precise,
as the case may
which is
be, and
inconsistent
in an
with the
additional
legal
equal
restriction of
amount
one
as
filing per
liquidated
10
damages.
years,
The
all
condition
paint a picture
pursues
of
to find
elaborate
the
fraudulent
violation prior
endeavors.
to the enforcement,
A
and
letter
finding
from attorney
violation must be
Jonathan
identified
Bernstein
by the
seems to
Department of
corroborate
Labor,
these
which
findings,
responsible to
acknowledging
conduct
that
the
all
audits in order to
documentation
find
from
violations of
Claudia
Section
Gale
29
was indeed
USC
counterfeit.
206,
In
207,
essence,
and
this intricate
255.
web of
If the
discrepancies,
Department of
assumed
Labor finds
identities,
violations
and
against
potential
any
fraudulent
employers,
activities
the DOL
positions
can move
Claudia
to enforce
Gale
29
as a notable
USC
figure in a
216B
seemingly elaborate
of the
scheme
Department of
with
Justice.
possible collaborations
After finding the
involving private
violation
legal
against an
entities.
employer by the Department of
It
Labor
underscores
shall
the
send memos
significance
to
of
each
thorough
worker
background
involved in order
checks
to
and
inform them
verification
about the
processes,
violation
especially
and the
when
opportunity
engaging
to
in
enforce
professional
the said
relationships.
violation against the employer. The letter shall instruct the workers to sign the consent and take an oath that shall be authorized by the
Identity
court
theft.
to enforce Section 18
Identity
USC,
theft and identity
Section
fraud are
401,
terms used to
or
refer to
29
all types of
USC,
crime
Section
in which someone
216.
wrongfully
The
obtains
Department
and
of
uses
Labor
another
has to
person's
coordinate
personal
to
data
comply
in
with the
some way
summons
that
and
involves
complaints and
fraud or
cover
deception,
sheet,
typically for
JS44,
economic
to
gain.
file it to the federal court
What's
under
the
Section
Department of
18
Justice doing about
USC,
identity
Section
theft and
401,
fraud?
or 29 USC,
The Department of
Section
Justice
216,
prosecutes
to
cases
enforce
of
the Social
identity
Security
theft and
benefit
fraud
under
under
the
a
federal
variety
law
of federal
called FICA.
statutes.
Under the
In
Section
the fall of
29
1998,
USC,
for example,
216A,
Congress passed
any
the Identity
person who
Theft and
willfully
Assumption
violates
Deterrence
any
Act.
of the provisions of
This
Section
legislation
215
created
of
a
this
new
title
offense of
shall,
identity
upon
theft,
conviction
which
thereof,
prohibits
be
knowingly
subject to a fine
transferring
of
or
not more
using,
than
without
$10,000,
lawful authority,
or to
a
the
means of
imprisonment for
identification
not
of
more
another
than 6
person with
months,
the
or
intent to
both.
commit or to
No
aid
person
or
shall be
abet
imprisoned
any
under this
unlawful activity
subsection
that constitutes
except
a
for an
violation of
offense
federal law,
committed after
or
the
that
conviction of
constitutes a
such
felony
person
under any
for a prior
applicable state
offense
or
under
local
this
law.
subsection.
This
Employers who
offense, in
improperly
most
classified
circumstances,
nurses as
carries a
independent
maximum term of
contractors,
15
and as a
years,
result,
imprisonment,
employers
a fine,
failed and
and
refused
criminal
to pay their
forfeiture of any
employer
personal
share
property
of the
used
Federal
or
Insurance
intended to be used to
Contribution
commit
Act,
the
FICA,
offense.
taxes on each
Schemes
nurse's
to commit
gross
identity
wages,
theft
and
or fraud
accordingly
may also
plaintiffs were
involve
required to
violations
pay
of
the
other
same.
statutes such
By
as
employers'
identification
failure and
fraud,
refusal to
credit
pay
card
their
fraud,
employer's share of
computer
FICA
fraud,
on behalf of
mail
nurses,
fraud, wire
employers
fraud,
were
or
unjustly
financial
enriched.
institution fraud.
By employers' failure and
Here,
refusal
an
to pay their
examination of
employer's
Claudia
share of
Gale,
FICA
assumed
on behalf of
identity,
nurses, and failure and
discrepancies,
refusal to
and
pay
alleged
nurses
fraudulent
for travel
activities
time
are
between
discussed.
consecutive assignments,
In a
they
perplexing turn of
exercised
events,
dominion over
evidence
and
suggests
appropriated
that
such
Claudia
funds
Gale
for their
may
own
not
use and
actually
benefit,
exist as an authentic
thereby depriving
individual.
nurses of the rights
Her
and benefits
purported
thereto.
affiliation with Harry's
Accordingly,
Nurses Registry
employers are
Incorporated,
guilty of
starting on
conversion.
February 20,
As a proximate result of
2007,
employers'
is riddled
conduct,
with
as alleged
inconsistencies.
herein, nurses suffer
An
damages
affidavit
and are
provided by
entitled
Mr.
to an
Michael
award of
Morgan raises
compensatory and
significant doubts
consequential
about the
damages.
legitimacy of Claudia's
All
identity.
other similarly situated
Several
employees
points of
are also
contention
entitled to
arise.
damages in the form of
Discrepancies in
uncompensated
personal
overtime
information,
wages,
Claudia's
liquidated
professional
damages,
nursing certificate
attorney's
lists an
fees,
address in
and other
Kingston, Jamaica,
damages so
West
as to
Indies.
preclude employers'
This
unjust
raises
enrichment.
questions about the
Pursuant to
veracity of her
Section
presence in the
216B,
U.S.
attached here to and
Furthermore,
filed with this
her
complaint as
inconsistent
exhibits
signatures
A
across
through late,
various
the
documents
consent to
only
become
deepen
party
these
nurses
suspicions.
executed by each nurse.
Document submission
According to
timing,
the Fair
an
Labor
oddity
Standard Act,
exists in the timeline of her
1938, a lawsuit
affiliation
shall
with
be brought
Harry's
against
Nurses
employers
Registry
under
Incorporated.
The FLSA Act.
The date she
However, per
reportedly
requirements
started
set
work
in order to
aligns
enforce
exactly
Section
with the day her
29
documents were
USC
faxed,
216B.
signaling a potential
The section
discrepancy.
provides a clear direction to
Suspicious
the parties involved in the
recommendation.
enforcement
A
of
recommendation
216B.
letter on behalf of
Any
Claudia
employer who
was
violates
submitted
the
by
provisions
Pete
of Section
Glanz from
206
White Globe
or Section
Placement
207
Incorporated.
of this title shall be
An
liable
internet
to the
search
employee
reveals
or
Pete
employees
Glanz's
affected
primary
in the amount of
profession
their
as a
unpaid
lawyer,
minimum
which
wages,
suggests
or
that
their
Claudia's
unpaid
placement at
overtime
H&R may have been a
compensation, as the
strategic
case may
move,
be, and
possibly
in an additional
aiming for a
equal amount
premeditated
as liquidated
lawsuit against the
damages.
registry.
The condition pursues to
Social
find the
Security
violation prior
concerns.
to the enforcement,
Claudia's Social
and finding
Security number,
violation must be identified by the Department of Labor, who is
XXXX,
responsible to
appears to
conduct the
belong
audits
to a
in order
deceased
to find
individual,
violations of
May
Section
White Chill,
29,
born on
USC
February 1,
206,
1945.
207, and 255.
This
If
implies
the Department
potential
of Labor
SSN
finds
fraud.
violations against any employers,
Multiple
the
identities.
DOL can
Claudia
move to
appears to
enforce 29
operate under
USC
multiple names across
216B
various
to the
states.
Department of Justice.
Names such as
After finding
Claudia
the
Gale,
violation against
Claudia
an employer by
Matthias,
the Department of
and
Labor
Claudia
shall send
Williams
memos
have
to
been
each worker
associated with
involved
her.
in order to inform them about
Intriguingly,
the violation
she seems
and
to
the
have
opportunity
replicated
to
the
enforce
identity
the
of
said
Williams
violation
Claudia
against the
Cecile,
employer.
a
The
relative
letter
of
shall
Sherilyn
instruct the
Williams,
workers to
a
sign
former
the
RN
consent
of Harry's
and
Home
take an
Care.
oath that shall be authorized
This assumed
by the court to
identity
enforce
even
Section
extends to
18
duplicating a
USC,
license number.
Section 401,
Such
or
deceptive
29
tactics
USC,
suggest
Section
a
216B
orchestrated scheme
The Department of
potentially
Labor has to
facilitated by a
coordinate
private
to comply
attorney,
with the summons
Mr.
and
Jonathan
complaints and
Bernstein.
cover sheet JS
Interstate
44
activities.
to file it to the
Claudia's
federal court
alleged
under
residences
Section
span
18
5
USC,
states,
Section
Florida,
401,
Georgia,
or 29
New York,
USC,
Maryland,
Section 216,
and South Carolina.
to enforce the Social Security
Given that
benefit
she lacks
under
valid
the federal
identification,
law called FICA.
it's plausible
Under
that she has
the Section
assumed someone
29
else's
USC,
identity.
216A
Furthermore, Her
Any
lack of
person
New
who
York State
willfully
residency
violates
suggests
any of the
she doesn't
provisions
possess
of
legitimate
Section
citizenship
215
papers.
of this title shall,
Other alarming
upon conviction
indicators,
thereof, be
Claudia's
subject
multiple
to a fine
IDs,
of not more than
several phone numbers,
$10,000,
overlapping
or to the
residences,
imprisonment
and
for not
multiple
more than
bankruptcy
6 months,
filings,
or
5
both.
times,
No
to be
person shall be
precise,
imprisoned
which is
under this
inconsistent with the
subsection,
legal restriction
except
of
for
one
an
filing
offense
for 10
committed
years.
after the
All paint a
conviction of
picture
such
of elaborate
person
fraudulent
for a prior
endeavors.
offense under this
A
subsection.
letter from attorney
Employers
Jonathan
who
Bernstein
improperly
seems to
classified
corroborate these
nurses as
findings,
independent
acknowledging that
contractors,
all
and as a
documentation
result,
from Claudia
employers
Gale
failed
was
and
indeed
refused to pay their
counterfeit.
employer's
In
share of the
essence,
Federal
this
Insurance
intricate web of
Contribution
discrepancies,
Act, FICA,
assumed
taxes
identities,
on each
and
nurse's
potential
gross
fraudulent
wages,
activities
and accordingly
positions Claudia
plaintiffs were
Gale
required
as a
to pay
notable
the
figure
same.
in a
By
seemingly elaborate
employers'
scheme
failure and
with
refusal to
possible
pay their employer's
collaborations
share of
involving
FICA on
private
behalf
legal
of
entities.
nurses, employers were
It underscores
unjustly
the significance
enriched.
of thorough
By
background
employers'
checks
failure
and
and refusal to
verification
pay their
processes,
employer's share
especially
of
when
FICA
engaging in
on behalf
professional
of nurses, and
relationships.
failure and refusal to pay nurses for travel time between consecutive assignments, they exercised dominion over and
Identity
appropriated such funds for their own
Identity
use
theft
and
and
benefit,
identity fraud are
thereby
terms
depriving
used to refer
nurses
to
of the
all
rights
types
and
of crime
benefits
in which
thereto.
someone wrongfully
Accordingly,
obtains and uses
employers
another
are
person's
guilty of
personal data
conversion.
in some
As
way
a
that
proximate
involves
result
fraud
of
or
employers'
deception,
conduct,
typically
as
for
alleged
economic gain.
herein, nurses suffer
What's the
damages and
Department
are
of Justice
entitled
doing
to an
about
award of
identity theft and
compensatory
fraud?
and consequential
The
damages.
Department of Justice
All other
prosecutes cases
similarly
of identity
situated
theft and
employees are
fraud
also
under a
entitled to
variety of federal
damages in the form of
statutes.
uncompensated
In the
overtime
fall of
wages,
1998,
liquidated
for
damages,
example, Congress
attorneys'
passed the
fees, and
Identity
other
Theft and Assumption
damages
Deterrence
so
Act.
as to preclude employers'
This
unjust
legislation
enrichment.
created a new
Pursuant
offense of
to Section
identity theft,
216b,
which prohibits
attached
knowingly
hereto and filed
transferring or
with this
using,
complaint as
without
exhibits
lawful
A
authority,
through late,
a
the
means of
consent to become
identification of a person with the
executed by
intent to
each
commit
nurse.
or to aid or
According to the
abet
Fair
any
Labor
unlawful
Standard Act,
activity that
1938,
constitutes a
a lawsuit
violation
shall
of
be
federal
brought
law
against
or
employers
that
under the
constitutes a
FLSA
felony
Act.
under any
However,
applicable
per
state or
requirements
local
are set
law.
in order to enforce Section
This
29
offense, in most
USC
circumstances,
216b.
carries a
The
maximum
section
term of
provides a clear
15 years
direction to the parties
imprisonment,
involved
a
in the
fine,
enforcement of
and criminal
216b.
forfeiture of any
Any
personal
employer
property
who
used
violates
or
the
intended to be
provisions of
used to
Section
commit the
206
offense.
or Section 207 of this title
Schemes to
shall be
commit
liable
identity
to the
theft or
employee
fraud
or
may
employees
also involve
affected in the amount
violations
of
of
their
other
unpaid minimum
statutes such
wages
as
for their
identification
unpaid
fraud,
overtime
credit card
compensation,
fraud,
as the case
computer
may
fraud,
be, and
mail
in an
fraud,
additional equal
wire
amount
fraud,
as
or
liquidated
financial
damages. The
institution
condition
fraud.
pursues to find the
Here,
violation
an
prior to
examination
the
of
enforcement,
Claudia
and
Gale,
finding
assumed
violation must be
identity,
identified by the
discrepancies,
Department of Labor,
and alleged
who is
fraudulent
responsible to
activities
conduct
are
the audits
discussed.
in order to find
In
violations
a
of
perplexing
Section
turn of
29,
events,
USC
evidence suggests that
206,
Claudia
207,
Gale may
and
not actually
255.
exist as
If
an
the
authentic
Department of Labor
individual.
finds violations
Her
against any
purported
employer,
affiliation with
the
Harry's
DOL
Nurses
can move
Registry
to enforce
Incorporated,
29
starting on
USC
February
216b
20th,
to the Department
2007,
of Justice.
is riddled with
After
inconsistencies.
finding the violation against an
An
employer
affidavit
by the
provided
Department
by
of
Mr.
Labor
Michael
shall send
Morgan
memos to
raises
each worker
significant
involved
doubts
in order
about
to
the
inform
legitimacy
them
of
about
Claudia's
the
identity.
violation and the opportunity to
Several
enforce
points
the
of
said
contention
violation
arise.
against the employer.
Discrepancies in
instruct
personal
the workers to
information.
sign the
Claudia's
consent and
professional
take an oath
nursing
that shall be
certificate lists an
authorized
address
by
in
the court to
Kingston,
enforce
Jamaica,
Section 18
West Indies.
USC, Section
This raises
401
questions
or
about the
29
veracity of her
USC,
presence in
Section
the U.S.
216. The Department of
Furthermore,
Labor has to
her
coordinate to
inconsistent
comply with the
signatures
summons
across
and
various
complaints
documents
and cover
only
sheet
deepen these
JS44
suspicions.
to file it to the federal
Document
court
submission
under Section
timing.
18
An oddity
USC,
exists in the
Section
timeline of
401
her
or
affiliation
29
with Harry's
USC,
Nurses
Section
Registry
216
Incorporated.
to enforce the Social
The date
Security
she
benefit
reportedly
under
started
the
work
federal law
aligns
called
exactly
FICA.
with the day her
Under
documents
the
were
Section
faxed,
29
signaling a
USC
potential discrepancy.
216A,
Suspicious
any person who
recommendation.
willfully
A
violates
recommendation
any of the
letter on
provisions
behalf
of
of
Section
Claudia was submitted
215
by
of this
Pete
title
Glanz
shall,
from White Globe
upon
Placement
conviction
Incorporated.
thereof, be subject to a
An
fine of
internet
not more
search
than
reveals Pete
$10,000,
Glanz's
or
primary
to the
profession as a
imprisonment
lawyer,
for not more
which
than
suggests
6
that
months,
Claudia's
or both.
placement at
No
H&R
person
may have
shall
been
be
a strategic
imprisoned under
move,
this
possibly
subsection,
aiming for a
except for an
premeditated
offense
lawsuit against the
committed after
registry.
the conviction of such
Social
person
Security
for a prior
concerns.
offense under
Claudia's
this
Social
subsection.
Security number,
Employers who improperly
125-82
classified nurses as independent
XXXX, appears to belong to
and
a
as a
deceased
result,
individual, May
employers
White
failed
Schill,
and refused
born
to
on
pay their
February 1st,
employer's share of the
1945.
Federal Insurance Contribution
This implies
Act,
potential
FICA,
SSN
taxes
fraud.
on each nurse's gross wages,
Multiple
and
identities,
accordingly
Claudia
plaintiffs
appears
were
to
required
operate
to pay
under
the
multiple
same.
names
By
across various
employers'
states.
failure and refusal to pay their
Names such
employer
as
share of
Claudia
FICA on
Gale,
behalf of
Claudia
nurses,
Mathias,
employers
and
were
Claudia
unjustly
Williams
enriched.
have been
By
associated with
employers'
her.
failure and refusal to pay their
Intriguingly,
employer's
she
share
seems to
of
have
FICA
replicated the
on behalf
identity
of
of
nurses and
Williams
failure
Claudia
and refusal to
Cecile,
pay
a
nurses
relative
for
of
travel
Sherilyn
time between
Williams, a
consecutive
former RN of
assignments.
Harry's home
They
care.
exercised dominion
This
over and
assumed identity
appropriated
even
such
extends
funds for
to
their own
duplicating
use
a
and
license
benefit,
number.
thereby depriving
Such
nurses of
deceptive
the rights and
tactics
benefits
suggest a
thereto.
well-orchestrated scheme
Accordingly,
potentially
employers are
facilitated
guilty
by
of
a private
conversion.
attorney
As
Mr.
approximate
Jonathan
result
Bernstein.
of employer's conduct, as
Interstate
alleged
activities.
herein,
Claudia's
nurses suffer
alleged
damages and
residences
are
span
entitled
5
to an
states:
award of
Florida,
compensatory
Georgia,
and consequential
New York,
damages.
Maryland, and
All
South
other
Carolina.
similarly situated
Given that
employees
she
are
lacks
also
valid
entitled to damages
identification,
in the
it's
form of
plausible that she has
uncompensated
assumed
overtime
someone
wages,
else's identity.
liquidated damages,
Furthermore,
attorneys'
her
fees,
lack of
and
New
other
York State residency
damages so
suggests
as
she
to
doesn't
preclude
possess
employers'
legitimate
unjust
citizenship
enrichment.
papers.
Pursuant to Section
Other alarming
216b,
indicators:
attached
Claudia's
hereto and
multiple
filed with
IDs,
this complaint
several
as
phone
exhibits
numbers,
A through
overlapping
late, the
residences,
consent to
and
become
multiple
party
bankruptcy
nurses
filings,
executed by each
5
nurse.
times, to be
According
precise,
to the Fair
which
Labor
is
Standard
inconsistent
Act
with the legal
1938,
restriction
a
of one
lawsuit shall
filing
be
per
brought
10
against
years,
employers
all
under
paint
the
a picture of
FLSA
elaborate
Act.
fraudulent
However,
endeavors.
per requirements are set
A
in order
letter
to
from
enforce
attorney
Section
Jonathan
29
Bernstein seems to
USC
corroborate these
216b.
findings,
The
acknowledging
section
that
provides
all
a clear direction
documentation
to the
from
parties
Claudia
involved in the
Gale
enforcement
was
of
indeed
216b.
counterfeit.
Any
In
employer
essence,
who violates
this
the
intricate
provisions
web
of
of
Section
discrepancies,
206 or
assumed
Section 207
identities,
of this
and
title shall be
potential
liable
fraudulent
to the
activities
employee or
positions
employees
Claudia
affected
Gale
in the
as a
amount of their
notable
unpaid
figure in a
minimum
seemingly
wages or
elaborate
their
scheme
unpaid
with
overtime
possible
compensation,
collaborations
as the case may
involving
be,
private legal
and in an
entities.
additional equal amount as
It
liquidated
underscores the
damages.
significance
The
of thorough
condition
background
pursues to
checks
find
and
the violation
verification
prior to the
processes,
enforcement,
especially
and
when
finding
engaging in
violation
professional
must be identified
relationships.
by the Department of Labor, who is responsible to conduct the audits in order to find violations of Section 29 USC
Identity
206, 207,
Identity
and
theft and
255.
identity
If the
fraud are
Department of
terms
Labor
used to
finds
refer to all
violations
types of
against
crime
any
in which
employers,
someone
the
wrongfully
DOL can
obtains and
move to
uses another
enforce
person's
29
personal
USC
data in some way that
216b
involves
to the
fraud or
Department of
deception,
Justice.
typically for
After
economic
finding the
gain.
violation against an
What's the
employer,
Department
by
of
the
Justice
Department of
doing
Labor
about
shall send
identity
memos
theft
to
and
each
fraud?
worker involved in order to
The
inform
Department
them
of
about
Justice
the
prosecutes
violation
cases
and the
of
opportunity
identity
to
theft
enforce
and
the said
fraud under a
violation
variety
against
of
the
federal
employer.
statutes.
The letter shall instruct the
In the
workers
fall of
to sign the
1998,
consent and
for
take an oath
example,
that shall be
Congress
authorized
passed the
by
Identity
court
Theft
to
and
enforce
Assumption
Section
Deterrence
18
Act.
USC,
This
Section
legislation
401,
created
or
a new
29
offense of
USC,
identity
Section
theft,
216.
which prohibits
The
knowingly
Department of Labor
transferring
has
or
to
using,
coordinate to
without
comply with
lawful
the summons
authority,
and
a
complaints
means
and
of
cover sheet
identification of another person
JS44
with the
to
intent
file
to
it to the
commit or
federal
to
court
aid
under
or
Section
abet
18
any unlawful
USC,
activity that
Section
constitutes
401,
a
or
violation
29
of federal
USC,
law,
Section
or that
216,
constitutes a
to
felony
enforce
under
the
any
Social
applicable
Security
state or
benefit under
local
the
law.
federal law called FICA.
This offense,
Under
in
the
most
Section 29
circumstances,
USC
carries a maximum term of 15
216A,
years
any person
imprisonment,
who
a
willfully
fine, and
violates
criminal
any of the
forfeiture of any
provisions
personal
of Section
property used or
215 of
intended
this
to be
title
used to
shall,
commit the
upon
offense.
conviction thereof, be
Schemes
subject
to
a
commit
fine of
identity
not more
theft
than
or fraud may
$10,000,
also involve
or to the
violations of other
imprisonment for not
statutes
more
such
than
as
6
identification
months, or
fraud,
both.
credit
No
card
person
fraud,
shall be
computer
imprisoned
fraud,
under this
mail
subsection
fraud,
except
wire
for an
fraud, or
offense
financial
committed after
institution
the
fraud.
conviction of such person
Here,
for
an
a prior
examination
offense
of
under this
Claudia
subsection.
Gale, assumed
Employers
identity,
who improperly
discrepancies,
classified
and
nurses
alleged
as
fraudulent
independent
activities are
contractors,
discussed.
and as a result,
In a
employers
perplexing turn of
failed and
events,
refused to
evidence
pay their
suggests that
employer's share
Claudia
of the
Gale
Federal
may not
Insurance
actually
Contribution
exist as an
Act,
authentic
FICA,
individual.
taxes on each
Her
nurse's gross
purported
wages,
affiliation with
and
Harry's
accordingly
Nurses Registry
plaintiffs were required
Incorporated,
to pay
starting
the
on
same.
February
By
20,
employers' failure and
2007,
refusal
is
to pay
riddled
their
with
employer's share of
inconsistencies.
FICA on behalf of
An
nurses,
affidavit provided
employers
by
were
Mr. Michael
unjustly
Morgan
enriched.
raises
By
significant
employers'
doubts about the
failure and
legitimacy
refusal
of
to pay their
Claudia's
employer's
identity.
share of FICA
Several
on behalf
points
of
of
nurses,
contention
and failure
arise.
and refusal to pay nurses for
Discrepancies in
travel time
personal
between
information,
consecutive
Claudia's
assignments.
professional
They
nursing
exercised
certificate lists
dominion
an
over
address
and
in Kingston,
appropriated such
Jamaica,
funds for
West
their own
Indies.
use and benefit,
This
thereby
raises
depriving
questions about the
nurses of the
veracity
rights
of her
and benefits
presence in the
thereto.
U.S.
Accordingly,
Furthermore,
employers are
her
guilty of
inconsistent
conversion.
signatures
As
across
approximate
various
result of
documents only
employers'
deepen these
conduct,
suspicions.
as alleged herein,
Document
nurses suffer
submission
damages
timing,
and are
an
entitled
oddity
to an award
exists
of
in the timeline of her
compensatory and
affiliation
consequential
with Harry's
damages.
Nurses Registry
All
Incorporated.
other similarly
The
situated
date she
employees are
reportedly
also
started
entitled
work
to
aligns
damages in
exactly
the
with
form
the day
of
her documents were
uncompensated
faxed,
overtime wages,
signaling a potential
liquidated
discrepancy.
damages, attorneys' fees,
Suspicious
and other
recommendation.
damages
A
so
recommendation
as to
letter on
preclude
behalf of
employers'
Claudia was
unjust
submitted by
enrichment.
P.
Pursuant
Plans
to
from
Section
White Globe Placement
216b,
Incorporated.
attached hereto and
An
filed with
internet
this
search
complaint as
reveals P.
exhibits A
Glanz's
through
primary
late, the
profession as a
consent to
lawyer,
become party
which
nurses
suggests that
executed
Claudia's
by each
placement at
nurse.
H&R may have been
According
been a
According to the Fair
strategic
Labor
move,
Standard Act,
possibly aiming for a
1938,
premeditated
a lawsuit shall be
lawsuit
brought
against the
against
Registry.
employers under the FLSA
Social
Act.
Security
However,
concerns.
per requirements are
Claudia's
set in
Social
order to
Security
enforce
number,
Section 29
125-82
USC
XXXX,
216B. The
appears to
section
belong
provides
to a
clear
deceased
direction to
individual,
parties involved
May
in the
White Chill,
enforcement of
born on
216B.
February 1st,
Any employer who
1945.
violates the provisions of Section
This implies
206
potential
or Section
SSN
207
fraud.
of this title shall be liable
Multiple
to the
identities.
employee or
Claudia
employees
appears to
affected in the
operate
amount of
under
their
multiple
unpaid
names
minimum
across
wages
various
or their
states.
unpaid overtime compensation,
Names such as
the
Claudia
case may
Gale,
be, and
Claudia
in an additional
Mathias,
equal amount
and
as
Claudia
liquidated
Williams
damages.
have been
The
associated
condition
with her.
pursues to find the violation prior to the
Intriguingly,
enforcement,
she seems to have
and finding
replicated the
violation
identity
must be
of
identified
Williams
by the
Claudia
Department of
Cecile,
Labor.
a
In
relative of Sherilyn Williams, a former RN of Harry's home care. This assumed identity even extends to duplicating a license number.
If the Department of Labor
Such
finds
deceptive
violations
tactics
against
suggest
any
a
employers,
well-orchestrated
the
scheme,
DOL can move to
potentially
enforce
facilitated by a
29
private
USC
attorney,
216B,
Mr. Jonathan
to the
Bernstein.
Department of Justice.
Interstate
After finding
activities.
the violation
Claudia's
against an
alleged
employer by the
residences
Department
span
of
5
Labor shall
states:
send memos
Florida,
to each worker
Georgia,
involved
New
in order
York,
to inform them
Maryland,
about the
and
the
South
violation
Carolina.
and the opportunity to enforce
Given that
the
she
said
lacks valid
violation against the
identification,
employer.
it's
The
plausible
letter shall
that she has
instruct the
assumed
workers
someone
to sign
else's
the
identity.
consent and take an oath that shall be
Furthermore,
authorized
her lack of
by
New
the
York
court to
state
enforce
residency
Section
suggests
18
she doesn't
USC,
possess legitimate
Section
citizenship
401,
papers.
or 29 USC,
Other
Section
alarming
216.
indicators:
The
Claudia's
Department of
multiple
Labor has
IDs,
to coordinate
several
to
phone
comply
numbers,
with the summons and
overlapping
complaints
residences,
and cover sheet
and multiple
JS
bankruptcy
44
filings,
to file it
5
to the federal
times,
court
to be
under
precise,
Section 18
which is
USC,
inconsistent with the
Section
legal restriction
401,
of one
or
filing
29
per 10
USC,
years,
Section
all paint a
216,
picture of
to
elaborate
enforce the
fraudulent
Social Security
endeavors.
benefit under the
A
federal
letter
law
from
called
attorney
FICA.
Jonathan Bernstein
Under the
seems to
Section
corroborate
29
these
USC,
findings, acknowledging that all
216A,
documentation
any
from
person
Claudia
who willfully
Gale was
violates
indeed
any of the
counterfeit.
provisions of
In
Section
essence,
215
this
of
intricate
this
web
title
of discrepancies,
shall, upon
assumed
conviction
identities,
thereof, be
and
subject
potential
to a fine of
fraudulent
not more than
activities positions
$10,000,
Claudia Gale
or to the
as a notable
imprisonment
figure
for
in
not
a
more than
seemingly
6
elaborate
months,
scheme
or both.
with possible
No person shall
collaborations
be
involving
imprisoned under
private
this
legal
subsection
entities.
except for
It
an
underscores the
offense committed
significance
after
of
the
thorough
conviction of
background
such
checks
person
and verification
for a prior
processes,
offense under this
especially when
subsection.
engaging in
Employers
professional
who
relationships.
improperly classified nurses as independent contractors, and as a result, employers failed and refused to pay their
Identity theft.
employers' share of the federal
Identity
Insurance
theft and
Contribution
identity fraud
Act,
are
FICA,
terms used to refer
taxes
to
on
all
each
types of
nurse's
crime
gross
in which
wages,
someone
and
wrongfully
accordingly,
obtains and uses
plaintiffs
another
were
person's
required to
personal
pay the
data
same.
in some way
By
that involves
employers'
fraud or
failure and
deception,
refusal to pay their
typically for
employer's share
economic
of
gain.
FICA on behalf of nurses,
What's the Department of
employers
Justice
were
doing about
unjustly
identity theft
enriched.
and fraud?
By employers' failure
The
and
Department of
refusal to
Justice
pay their
prosecutes
to pay
statutes.
nurses for travel time
In the
between
fall of
consecutive
1998,
assignments,
for example,
they exercised
Congress
dominion
passed the
over and
Identity Theft
appropriated
and
such
Assumption
funds
Deterrence
for their
Act.
own use and benefit,
This
thereby
legislation
depriving
created a new
nurses of
offense
the
of
rights and
identity
benefits
theft,
thereto.
which prohibits
Accordingly,
knowingly
employers
transferring
are
or
guilty
using,
of
without
conversion.
lawful authority,
As a proximate
a means
result
of
of employers'
identification of
conduct,
another person
as
with the
alleged
intent to
herein,
commit or
nurses
to aid
suffer
or
damages
abet
and are
any
entitled
unlawful
to an
activity
award of
that constitutes a
compensatory and
violation of
consequential
federal law,
damages.
or that
All
constitutes
other
a felony
similarly
under any
situated
applicable state
employees
or
are also
local law.
entitled to damages in
This
the form
offense,
of
in most
uncompensated overtime
circumstances,
wages,
carries a
liquidated
maximum term of
damages,
15
attorneys'
years
fees,
imprisonment,
and other
a fine,
damages
and criminal
so as to
forfeiture of any
preclude
personal
employers'
property
unjust
used or
enrichment.
intended to be used to
Pursuant to
commit the
Section
offense.
216B, attached
Schemes to
hereto and
commit
filed
identity
with this
theft or
complaint as
fraud may
exhibits
also
A
involve
through 8, the
violations of other
consent to become
statutes
party
such as
nurses
identification
executed by
fraud,
each nurse.
credit card fraud,
According to the
computer
Fair Labor
fraud,
Standard
mail
Act
fraud,
1938,
wire
a
fraud,
lawsuit
or
shall be brought
financial
against
institution
employers
fraud.
under the FLSA Act.
Here, an examination
However,
of
per requirements
Claudia
are set in
Gale,
order to
assumed
enforce Section
identity,
29
discrepancies,
USC
and alleged
216B.
fraudulent
The
activities
section
are
provides a
discussed.
clear direction to the parties
In a
involved in
perplexing
the
turn of
enforcement
events,
216B.
evidence suggests that
Any
Claudia
employer who
Gale may
violates
not
the provisions
actually
of Section
exist as an
206
authentic
or Section
individual.
207 of this title
Her
shall be
purported
liable
affiliation
to the
with Harry's
employee or
Nurses
employees
Registry
affected in
Incorporated,
the amount of
starting
their
on
unpaid
February
minimum
20,
wages, or their
2007,
unpaid overtime
is riddled with
compensation, as the
inconsistencies.
case may be, and in
An
an additional
affidavit
equal
provided
amount
by
as
Mr. Michael
liquidated
Morgan
damages.
raises
The
significant
condition
doubts
pursues
about
to
the
find a
legitimacy of
violation
Claudia's
prior to the
identity.
enforcement, and finding
Several
violation
points
must
of
be
contention
identified by the
arise.
Department of Labor, who is
Discrepancies in
responsible to
personal
conduct the
information.
audits in order to
Claudia's
find
professional
violations of
nursing
Section
certificate
29,
lists an address in
USC
Kingston,
206,
Jamaica,
207,
West
and
Indies.
255.
This
If the
raises
Department of
questions
Labor
about
finds
the veracity of
violations
her
against
presence
any
in the
employers,
U.S.
the DOL can move
Furthermore,
to enforce
her
29
inconsistent
USC
signatures
216B
across various
to the
documents
Department
only
of
deepen
Justice.
these suspicions.
After finding the violation
Document
against an
submission
employer
timing.
by the
An
Department of
oddity
Labor shall
exists
send
in the
memos to
timeline
each
of her
worker
affiliation
involved in
with
order to
Harry's
inform
Nurses
them
Registry
about the
Incorporated.
violation and the opportunity
The
to
date she
enforce the
reportedly
said
started work
violation
aligns
against the
exactly
employer.
with the day
The
her
letter shall
documents were
instruct the
faxed,
workers to
signaling
sign
a
the
potential
consent and take
discrepancy.
an oath that shall be authorized
Suspicious
by the court to
recommendation.
enforce
A
Section
recommendation
18
letter on
USC,
behalf of Claudia
Section
was submitted
401,
by
or
P.
29
Glanz from
USC,
White Globe
Section
Placement
216.
Incorporated.
The Department of
An
Labor has
internet
to
search
coordinate
reveals
to
P.
comply with the
Lanza's primary profession as a lawyer, which suggests that Claudia's placement at HNR may have been a strategic move, possibly aiming for a premeditated lawsuit against the Registry. Social Security concerns. Claudia's Social Security number, 125-82XXXX, appears to belong to a deceased individual, May White Show, born on February 1, 1945. This implies potential SSN fraud. Multiple identities. Claudia appears to operate under multiple names across various states.
Or both. No
Names
person
such
shall
as
be
Claudia
imprisoned under
Gale,
this
Claudia
subsection
Mathias,
except for an
and Claudia
offense
Williams
committed
have
after
been
the
associated
conviction
with
of
her.
such person for a prior
Intriguingly,
offense under
she
this
seems to have
subsection.
replicated the
Employers
identity
who
of Williams
improperly
Claudia
classified
Cecile,
nurses
a
as
relative of
independent
Sherilyn Williams,
contractors,
a
and as a
former
result,
RN of Harry's Home Care.
employers failed and refused
This
to pay their
assumed identity
employer's
even
share
extends
of the
to
Federal
duplicating a
Insurance
license
Contribution
number.
Act, FICA,
Such
taxes on
deceptive
each
tactics
nurse's
suggest
gross
a
wages,
well-orchestrated
and
scheme,
accordingly
potentially
plaintiffs were
facilitated
required
by
to
a
pay the
private
same.
attorney, Mr.
By
Jonathan
employers'
Bernstein.
failure and refusal to pay their
Interstate
employer's share of
activities.
FICA on
Claudia's
behalf of
alleged
nurses,
residences span
employers were
5 states,
unjustly
Florida,
enriched.
Georgia,
By employers'
New York,
failure and refusal
Maryland,
to pay
and
their
South
employer's
Carolina.
share of FICA
Given
on
that
behalf
she
of
lacks
nurses
valid
and failure and
identification,
refusal to pay
it's
nurses
plausible
for
that she
travel
has
time
assumed
between
someone else's
consecutive
identity.
assignments, they exercised
Furthermore,
dominion
her lack
over
of
and
New York State
appropriated such
residency
funds for
suggests
their own
she
use
doesn't
and
possess
benefit,
legitimate citizenship
thereby
papers.
depriving nurses of the rights
Other
and benefits
alarming
thereto.
indicators. Claudia's
Accordingly,
multiple
employers
IDs,
are guilty
several
of
phone
conversion.
numbers,
As
overlapping
a proximate
residences,
result of
and
employers'
multiple
conduct,
bankruptcy
as
filings,
alleged herein,
5 times,
nurses
to
suffer
be
damages
precise,
and are
which is
entitled to an
inconsistent
award
with
of
the legal restriction
compensatory
of one
and
filing for
consequential
10
damages.
years. All paint
All
a picture
other
of elaborate
similarly
fraudulent
situated
endeavors.
employees are also
A
entitled to
letter from
damages
attorney
in the
Jonathan
form of
Bernstein seems to
uncompensated overtime
corroborate
wages,
these findings,
liquidated
acknowledging
damages,
that all
attorney's
documentation from
fees, and
Claudia
other
Gale was
damages
indeed
so as
counterfeit.
to preclude
In
employers'
essence,
unjust
this
enrichment.
intricate web of
Pursuant to Section
discrepancies, assumed
216b,
identities,
attached
and
hereto
potential
and
fraudulent
filed with this
activities
complaint as
positions
exhibits
Claudia
A through
Gale
late,
as a
the
notable
consent to
figure
become
in a
party
seemingly
nurses
elaborate
executed
scheme
by each
with
nurse.
possible collaborations
According to the Fair
involving
Labor
private
Standard
legal
Act
entities.
1938, a
It
lawsuit
underscores
shall
the
be brought against
significance of
employers
thorough
under the
background checks
FLSA
and
Act.
verification
However,
processes,
per requirements are
especially
set
when
in order to
engaging in
enforce
professional
Section 29
relationships.
USC 216b. The section provides a clear direction to the parties involved in the enforcement of 216b.
Identity theft.
Any employer who violates
Identity
the
theft
provisions
and
of Section
identity fraud are
206 or
terms
Section
used to refer
207
to
of
all
this title
types
shall
of
be
crime in
liable
which
to
someone
the
wrongfully
employee or
obtains and
employees
uses another
affected in the
person's
amount of
personal
their
data
unpaid
in
minimum
some way that
wages or
involves
their
fraud or
unpaid
deception,
overtime
typically for
compensation,
economic
as the case
gain.
may be, and in an
What's the
additional
Department
equal
of
amount
Justice
as
doing about
liquidated
identity
damages.
theft and
The
fraud?
condition pursues to
The
find the
Department of
violation
Justice
prior to the
prosecutes
enforcement,
cases of
and finding
identity theft
violation
and
must be
fraud
identified
under a
by the
variety of
Department
federal
Labor,
statutes.
who is responsible to
In
conduct
the
the
fall of
audits in order to find
1998,
violations
for
of Section
example,
29,
Congress passed the
USC
Identity Theft
206,
and Assumption
207,
Deterrence
and
Act.
255.
This
If the
legislation
Department of Labor
created a
finds
new offense of
violations
identity
against any
theft,
employers,
which prohibits
the DOL can
knowingly
move to
transferring
enforce
or
29
using,
USC
without lawful authority,
216b
a means
to
of
the Department of
identification of
Justice.
another person with
After
the
finding
intent
the
to
violation
commit or to
against an
aid or
employer by the
abet any
Department of
unlawful
Labor shall send
activity
memos
that
to each
constitutes a
worker
violation
involved
of
in order to
federal law
inform them
or
about
that
the
constitutes a
violation and
felony
the
under
opportunity
any
to
applicable
enforce the
state
said
or local
violation
law.
against the employer.
This
The letter
offense,
shall
in
instruct
most
the workers to
circumstances,
sign the
carries a
consent
maximum
and take an
term
oath
of
that shall be
15 years
authorized
imprisonment,
by the court
a
to
fine,
enforce Section
and criminal
18
forfeiture of any
USC,
personal
Section
property used
401,
or intended to be
29
used to commit the
USC, Section
offense.
216. The
Schemes to
Department of
commit
Labor has
identity
to
theft or
coordinate to
fraud
comply
may
with the
also
summons
involve
and complaints
violations
and
of
cover
other
sheet
statutes such as
JS44
identification
to file
fraud,
it to the federal
credit card
court under
fraud,
Section
computer
18
fraud,
USC,
mail fraud,
Section 401,
wire fraud,
or 29
financial
USC,
institution
Section
fraud.
216 to enforce
Here,
the Social
an
Security
examination of
benefit under
Claudia
the federal
Gale,
law called
assumed
FICA.
identity,
Under the
discrepancies,
Section
and
29
alleged
USC
fraudulent activities are discussed.
216A, any person
In a perplexing
who
turn
willfully
of
violates
events,
any of the
evidence suggests that
provisions of
Claudia
Section
Gale
215
may not
of this
actually
title
exist
shall,
as an authentic
upon
individual.
conviction thereof, be subject
Her
to a
purported
fine of not
affiliation
more
with
than
Harry's
$10,000,
Nurses Registry
or to the
Incorporated,
imprisonment
starting on
for
February
not more than
20,
6 months,
2007,
or both.
is
No
riddled with
person shall be
inconsistencies.
imprisoned under this subsection,
An affidavit
except
provided
for
by
an
Mr.
offense
Michael Morgan
committed
raises
after the
significant
conviction of
doubts
such
about the
person
legitimacy
for a
of
prior
Claudia's
offense
identity.
under this subsection.
Several
Employers
points of
who
contention
improperly
arise.
classified nurses
Discrepancies
as
in
independent
personal
contractors,
information.
and as a result,
Claudia's professional
employers
nursing
failed and
certificate lists
refused
an
to pay
address
their
in Kingston,
employer's share
Jamaica,
of the Federal
West
Insurance
Indies.
Contribution Act.
This raises
FICA,
questions about the
taxes on each
veracity of her
nurse's gross
presence in the
wages,
U.S.
and accordingly, plaintiffs
Furthermore,
were
her
required to pay the
inconsistent
same.
signatures
By
across various
employers' failure
documents
and
only
refusal to
deepen
pay
these
their employer's
suspicions.
share of FICA on
Document
behalf of
submission
nurses,
timing.
employers
An
were
oddity
unjustly
exists in the
enriched.
timeline of her
By employers'
affiliation with
failure
Harry's
and
Nurses
refusal to pay
Registry
their employer's
Incorporated.
share employer of FICA
The date
on
she
behalf of
reportedly
nurses
started
and
work
failure and
aligns
refusal to
exactly
pay
with the day
nurses
her
for travel
documents were
time
faxed,
between consecutive
signaling a
assignments,
potential
they
discrepancy.
exercised dominion
Suspicious
over and appropriated
recommendation.
such
A
funds for their
recommendation
own
letter
use
on
and
behalf
benefit,
of Claudia was
thereby
submitted by
depriving
Pete
nurses of the
Glanz from
rights and
White Globe
benefits
Placement
thereto.
Incorporated.
Accordingly,
An
employers are
internet
guilty
search
of
reveals
conversion.
Pete Glanz's
As a
primary
proximate
profession
result of
as a lawyer,
employers' conduct,
which suggests
as
that
alleged
Claudia's
herein,
placement at
nurses suffer
HNR may have been a
damages and are
strategic
entitled
move,
to an award of
possibly aiming for a
compensatory and
premeditated
consequential
lawsuit
damages.
against the registry.
All other
Social
similarly
Security
situated
concerns.
employees are also
Claudia's
entitled
Social
to
Security
damages
number,
in the form of
125
uncompensated overtime wages,
unidentified-82XXXX
liquidated
appears
damages,
to belong to a
attorney's
deceased
fees,
individual,
and other
May White Show,
damages
born
so
on
as to
February
preclude
1st,
employers' unjust
1945.
enrichment.
This
Pursuant to
implies
Section
potential
216B,
SSN fraud.
attached here to and filed
Multiple
with this complaint
identities.
as exhibits
Claudia
A
appears
through
to
late,
operate
the
under
consent to
multiple
become
names
party
across
nurses
various
executed
states.
by each nurse.
Names such
According
as
to the
Claudia
Fair Labor
Gale,
Standard Act,
Claudia Mathias,
1938, a
and
lawsuit
Claudia
shall be brought
Williams
against
have been
employers under
associated
the
with her.
FLSA Act.
Intriguingly,
However, per
she
requirements
seems
are
to
set
have
in order to
replicated the
enforce Section
identity of
29
Williams Claudia
USC
Cecile, a
216B.
relative of
The
Sherilyn
section
Williams,
provides a
a
clear
former
direction to
RN
the
of
parties
Harry's Home
involved in
Care.
the enforcement of 216B.
This assumed identity
Any
even
employer
extends
who
to
violates the
duplicating a
provisions of
license
Section
number.
206 or Section
Such
207
deceptive
of this title
tactics
shall be
suggest a
liable to the
well-orchestrated
employee
scheme,
or employees
potentially
affected in the
facilitated
amount
by a
of their
private
unpaid
attorney,
minimum
Mr.
wages, or
Jonathan
their
Bernstein.
unpaid overtime compensation,
Interstate
as the case
activities.
may be,
Claudia's
and in an
alleged
additional
residences
equal
span
amount
5
as liquidated
states:
damages.
Florida,
The condition
Georgia,
pursues
New York,
to find the violation
Maryland,
prior
and
to
South
the enforcement,
Carolina.
and finding violation
Given that
must
she
be
lacks
identified
valid
by the Department of
identification,
Labor,
it's
who is
plausible that
responsible
she
to
has
conduct
assumed
the
someone
audits in
else's
order to find
identity.
violations of Section
Legitimate
If the Department
citizenship
of Labor
papers.
finds violations against
Other
any
alarming
employers,
indicators:
the DOL
Claudia's
can move
multiple
to enforce
IDs,
29
several
USC
phone numbers,
216B
overlapping
to the
residences,
Department of
and
Justice.
multiple bankruptcy filings.
After finding the
5
violation
times,
against an
to be
employer
precise,
by the Department
which is
of Labor
inconsistent
shall send
with the
memos
legal
to each
restriction
worker
of one
involved
filing
in order
per
to
10
inform
years.
them about
All
the
paint a
violation
picture of
and the
elaborate
opportunity
fraudulent
to
endeavors.
enforce the said violation
A letter
against
from
the
Attorney
employer.
Jonathan
The letter shall
Bernstein seems
instruct
to
the
corroborate
workers to
these
sign the
findings,
consent and take an
acknowledging
oath
that
that
all
shall be
documentation
authorized
from
by the
Claudia
court to
Gale
enforce
was
Section
indeed
18
counterfeit.
USC,
In
Section
essence,
401,
this
or
intricate
29
web of
USC,
discrepancies,
Section
assumed
216.
identities,
The
and
Department
potential
of Labor has
fraudulent
to
activities
coordinate to
positions
comply with the
Claudia
summons and
Gale
complaints
as a
and
notable
cover
figure
sheet
in a
JS44
seemingly elaborate
to
scheme
file it
with
to the
possible
federal court under
collaborations
Section
involving
18
private
USC,
legal entities.
Section 401,
It
or
underscores
29
the
USC,
significance
Section
of thorough
216
background checks
to
and
enforce the Social
verification
Security
processes,
benefit under the
especially
federal
when
law
engaging
called
in
FICA.
professional relationships.
Under the Section 29 USC 216A, any person who willfully violates any of the
Identity
provisions
theft.
of Section 215
Identity
of
theft
this
and
title
identity
shall,
fraud are
upon
terms used to
conviction
refer to
thereof,
all
be
types
subject
of
to a
crime in
fine
which
of not
someone
more than
wrongfully
$10,000
obtains and uses another
or to
person's
the
personal
imprisonment
data
for
in
not
some
more
way
than
that
6
involves
months,
fraud or
both.
deception,
No
typically
person
for
shall be
economic gain.
imprisoned under this subsection
What's the Department of
except
Justice
for an
doing about
offense
identity
committed
theft
after
and
the
fraud?
conviction of such
The
person
Department
for
of
a
Justice
prior offense
prosecutes
under this
cases of
subsection.
identity theft and
Employers
fraud
who
under a
improperly
variety of
classified
federal
nurses
statutes.
as independent contractors,
In the fall of
and as a result,
1998, for
employers
example,
failed
Congress
and refused
passed
to
the
pay their
Identity Theft
employer
and Assumption
share of the
Deterrence
Federal
Act.
Insurance Contribution
This
Act,
legislation
FICA,
created a
taxes
new
on
offense
each
of
nurse's
identity
gross
theft,
wages,
which
and
prohibits
accordingly
knowingly
plaintiffs
transferring
were
or
required
using,
to pay the
without
same
lawful authority,
by
a
employers'
means of
failure and
identification
refusal to
of
pay their
another person
employer's
with the
share of
intent to
FICA on
commit or
behalf
to
of
aid
nurses.
or abet any
Employers were
unlawful
unjustly
activity that
enriched
constitutes a
by
violation
employers'
of federal
failure and
law,
refusal
or
to
that
pay their
constitutes a
employer's
felony
share of
under any
FICA
applicable
on behalf
state
of
or local
nurses, and
law.
failure and refusal to pay
This
nurses
offense,
for
in
travel
most
time between
circumstances,
consecutive
carries
assignments.
a maximum
They
term of
exercised
15 years
dominion over
imprisonment,
and
a
appropriated
fine,
such
and
funds for
criminal
their own
forfeiture
use
of
and
any
benefit,
personal property used
thereby
or
depriving
intended to be
nurses of
used
the
to
rights
commit
and
the
benefits
offense.
thereto.
Schemes
Accordingly,
to commit
employers are
identity
guilty
theft or
of
fraud
conversion.
may also
As a
involve
proximate
violations
result
of
of
other
employers'
statutes
conduct,
such as
as alleged
identification
herein,
fraud,
nurses
credit card
suffer
fraud,
damages and are
computer
entitled
fraud,
to an
mail
award of
fraud, wire
compensatory and
fraud, or
consequential
financial
damages.
institution fraud.
All other similarly
Here, an
situated
examination
employees
of
are also
Claudia
entitled
Gale,
to damages
assumed
in the form
identity,
of uncompensated
discrepancies,
overtime
and alleged
wages,
fraudulent
liquidated
activities
damages,
are discussed.
attorney's fees,
In a
and other
perplexing turn of
damages
events,
so
evidence
as to
suggests
preclude
that
employers'
Claudia
unjust
Gale may
enrichment.
not actually
Pursuant
exist
to
as an
Section
authentic individual.
216B, attached here
Her
to and
purported
filed with this
affiliation with
complaint
Harry's
as
Nurses
exhibits
Registry
A through
Incorporated,
late, the
starting
consent
on
to become
February
party
20,
nurses executed by
2007,
each nurse.
is riddled with
According to the Fair
inconsistencies.
Labor Standard Act,
An affidavit
1938,
provided
a
by
lawsuit
Mr.
shall be
Michael
brought
Morgan
against
raises
employers
significant
under the
doubts about the
FLSA Act.
legitimacy of
However,
Claudia's
per
identity.
requirements are set in order to enforce
Several
Section
points of
29
contention arise.
USC 216B.
Discrepancies in
The
personal
section provides a
information,
clear direction
Claudia's
to the parties
professional
involved in
nursing
the enforcement
certificate
of
lists an address
216B.
in Kingston,
Any
Jamaica,
employer who
West
violates the
Indies.
provisions of Section 206
This raises
or
questions questions about the veracity of her presence in the U.S. Furthermore, her inconsistent signatures across various documents only deepen these suspicions. Document submission timing. An oddity exists in the timeline of her affiliation with Harry's Nurses Registry Incorporated. The date she reportedly started work aligns exactly with the day her documents were signaling a potential discrepancy. Suspicious recommendation. A recommendation letter on behalf of Claudia was submitted by Pete Glanz from White Globe Placement Incorporated. An internet search reveals Pete Glanz's primary profession as a lawyer, which suggests that Claudia's placement at HNR may possibly aiming for a premeditated lawsuit against the Registry. Social Security concerns. Claudia's Social Security number, 125-82XXXX, appears to belong to a deceased individual, May Whiteshill, born on February 1, 1945. This implies potential SSN fraud.
The Department of Labor
multiple
has to coordinate
identities.
to comply
Claudia
with the summons
appears
and
to
complaints
operate
and
under
cover
multiple
sheet
names
JS
across
44
various states.
to file it to the federal court
Names
under
such as
Section
Claudia
18
Gale,
USC,
Claudia
Section
Mathias,
401,
and
or
Claudia
29
Williams
USC,
have
Section
been associated with
216,
her.
to enforce the Social Security
Intriguingly,
benefit
she
under
seems
the
to have
federal law
replicated
called
the
FICA.
identity of Williams
Under the
Claudia
Section
Cecile,
29
a
USC
relative of Sherilyn Williams,
216A,
a former RN
any
of Harry's
person
Home
who
Care.
willfully violates
This
any
assumed
of the
identity
provisions of
even
Section
extends to
215
duplicating a
of this
license
title
number.
shall, upon conviction
Such deceptive
thereof, be
tactics
subject to
suggest a
fine of not more than
well-orchestrated scheme,
$10,000,
potentially
or to
facilitated
the
by a
imprisonment
private
for
attorney,
not more
Mr.
than 6
Jonathan
months,
Bernstein.
or both. No person
Interstate
shall be
activities.
imprisoned under
Claudia's
this subsection
alleged residences
except
span
for
5
an offense
states,
committed
Florida,
after the
Georgia,
conviction of
New
such
York,
person
Maryland,
for a prior
and
offense
South Carolina.
under this subsection.
Given that
Employers
she
who
lacks valid
improperly classified
identification,
nurses
it's
as
plausible that
independent
she has assumed
contractors,
someone
and
else's
as a result,
identity.
employers failed and
Furthermore,
refused
her
to pay
lack
their
of New York State
employer's share
residency
of the Federal
suggests she
Insurance
doesn't possess
Contribution
legitimate
Act,
citizenship
FICA,
papers.
taxes on each nurse's
Other
gross
alarming
wages,
indicators.
and accordingly
Claudia's multiple
plaintiffs were
IDs,
required to
several
pay
phone
the same.
numbers,
By
overlapping
employers'
residences,
failure and
and
refusal
multiple
to pay their
bankruptcy
employer's
filings,
share of FICA
5
on
times,
behalf of
to be
nurses,
precise,
employers
which is
were
inconsistent
unjustly
with the legal
enriched.
restriction of
By
one
employers'
filing per
failure
10
and
years.
refusal to
All
pay their
paint a
employer's
picture of
share
elaborate
of
fraudulent
FICA
endeavors.
on behalf of nurses, and
A
failure
letter
and
from
refusal
attorney
to pay
Jonathan
nurses
Bernstein
for travel
seems
time
to
between
corroborate these
consecutive
findings,
assignments.
acknowledging
They
that all
exercised dominion
documentation
over
from
and
Claudia
appropriated
Gale
such
was
funds
indeed
for their own
counterfeit.
use and benefit,
In essence,
thereby
this
depriving
intricate
nurses
web of
of the rights and
discrepancies,
benefits
assumed
thereto.
identities,
Accordingly,
and potential
employers are
fraudulent
guilty
activities
of conversion.
positions Claudia
As a
Gale
proximate
as a
result of
notable figure
employers'
in a
conduct,
seemingly
as
elaborate
alleged
scheme
herein,
with possible
nurses suffer damages
collaborations
and are
involving
entitled
private
to an
legal
award of
entities.
compensatory and
It
consequential
underscores the
damages.
significance of thorough
All
background
other
checks and
similarly
verification
situated employees
processes,
are also
especially
entitled
when
to
engaging in
damages in the
professional
form of
relationships.
uncompensated overtime wages, liquidated damages, attorney's fees, and other damages so as
Identity
to preclude
theft.
employers' unjust
Identity
enrichment.
theft and identity
Pursuant to
fraud
Section
are terms used to
216B,
refer to all
attached
types of
hereto
crime
and
in
filed
which
with
someone
this
wrongfully
complaint as
obtains and
exhibits
uses
A
another
through
person's
late the
personal
consent to
data
become
in some
party
way that
nurses
involves fraud
executed
or
by each
deception,
nurse.
typically for
According to
economic
the Fair
gain.
Labor Standard Act,
What's the Department of
1938,
Justice
a
doing
lawsuit
about
shall be
identity
brought against
theft and
employers
fraud?
under the FLSA
The
Act.
Department of Justice
However, per
prosecutes
requirements are
cases
set
of
in order to
identity
enforce
theft
Section
and fraud
29
under a variety of
USC
federal statutes.
216B. The
In
section
the fall
provides
of
a clear direction to the
1998,
parties
for
involved in
example,
the enforcement
Congress
of
passed the
216B.
Identity Theft and
Any
Assumption
employer who
Deterrence
violates
Act.
the provisions of Section
This
206
legislation
or
created
Section
a new
207
offense
of
of
this title
identity
shall be
theft,
liable to
which
the
prohibits
employee
knowingly
or employees
transferring or
affected in the
using,
amount of their
without
unpaid
lawful
minimum
authority,
wages,
a
or
means
their
of
unpaid
identification
overtime
of another person with the
compensation, as the
intent
case
to
may
commit
be,
or
and
to
in an
aid or
additional
abet
equal
any
amount as
unlawful
liquidated
activity
damages.
that
The
constitutes a
condition
violation of
pursues
federal
to find
law,
the violation
or that
prior to the
constitutes a
enforcement,
felony under
and
any
finding
applicable
violation
state
must be
or local
identified
law.
by the Department of Labor,
This
who is
offense,
responsible
in most
to conduct the audits
circumstances,
in order to
carries a
find
maximum
violations
term of
Section
15
29
years imprisonment,
USC
a fine,
206,
and criminal
207,
forfeiture
and
of any
255.
personal property
If the
used
Department
or
of Labor
intended to
finds
be used to
violations
commit the
against any
offense.
employers, the DOL
Schemes to
can move
commit
to
identity
enforce
theft
29
or fraud
USC
may also involve
216B
violations
to the
of other
Department of
statutes
Justice.
such as identification
After finding the
fraud,
violation
credit
against
card
an
fraud,
employer by the
computer
Department of
fraud,
Labor
mail
shall send
fraud,
memos to each
wire
worker
fraud,
involved
or
in order to
financial
inform them
institution
about
fraud.
the violation and the
Here,
opportunity
an
to
examination
enforce the
of
said
Claudia
violation
Gale,
against the
assumed
employer.
identity,
The letter shall
discrepancies,
instruct the workers
and
to
alleged
sign the
fraudulent
consent
activities
and take
are
an oath that
discussed.
shall be authorized
In a
by the court
perplexing
to
turn of
enforce
events,
Section 18
evidence suggests
USC,
that Claudia
Section
Gale
401,
may not
or
actually
29
exist as an
USC,
authentic
Section
individual.
216. The
Her
Department of
purported
Labor has to
affiliation with
coordinate
Harry's
to
Nurses
comply with the
Registry
summons and
Incorporated,
complaints and
starting
cover
on
sheet
February 20,
JS44,
2007,
to file it to the
is
federal
riddled with
court under Section
inconsistencies.
18 USC,
An
Section
affidavit
401,
provided by
or
Mr.
29
Michael Morgan
USC,
raises
Section
significant
216,
doubts about the
to enforce
legitimacy
the
of
Social
Claudia's
Security
identity.
benefit under the federal law
Several
called FICA.
points of contention
Under
arise.
the Section 29 USC
Discrepancies in personal information. Claudia's professional nursing certificate lists an address in Kingston, Jamaica, West Indies.
Of this title shall,
This raises
upon
questions
conviction,
about the veracity of her presence in the U.S. Furthermore, her inconsistent signatures across various documents only deepen these suspicions.
No person shall be imprisoned under
Document
this
submission
subsection
timing.
except
An
for an
oddity
offense
exists in the
committed
timeline
after
of
the
her
conviction
affiliation
of
with
such
Harry's
person
Nurses
for
Registry
prior offense
Incorporated.
under this subsection.
The date she
Employers
reportedly
who
started work
improperly
aligns
classified
exactly with the
nurses
day
as
her documents were
independent
faxed,
contractors, and as a
signaling a
result,
potential discrepancy.
employers failed and refused
Suspicious
to pay their
recommendation.
employer's share
A recommendation
of the
letter
Federal
on behalf of
Insurance
Claudia
Contribution
was
Act,
submitted
FICA,
by P.
taxes on
Glanz
each
from White
nurse's
Globe
gross
Placement
wages,
Incorporated.
and accordingly
An
plaintiffs were
internet
required
search
to pay
reveals
the
P.
same.
Glanz's
By
primary
employers'
profession as a
failure and
lawyer,
refusal to
which
pay their
suggests that
employer's share
Claudia's
of FICA
placement
on
at
behalf of
H&R may have
nurses,
been a strategic
employers
move,
were unjustly
possibly aiming
enriched.
for a
By
premeditated
employers'
lawsuit
failure
against
and
the
refusal
registry.
to pay their employer's share
Social
of
Security
FICA
concerns.
on behalf of
Claudia's
nurses and
Social
failure and
Security
refusal
number,
to pay nurses for travel time
125-82
between consecutive
XXXX,
assignments,
appears to
they
belong to a
exercised
deceased
dominion
individual,
over and
May White
appropriated
Show,
such funds
born
for
on
their own
February
use
1,
and benefit,
1945.
thereby depriving nurses of
This
the rights
implies
and benefits
potential
thereto.
SSN fraud.
Accordingly, employers
Multiple
are guilty
identities.
of conversion.
Claudia
As
appears
a
to
proximate
operate
result
under
of
multiple
employers'
names
conduct,
across various
as alleged
states.
herein, nurses
Names
suffer
such as
damages and are
Claudia
entitled
Gale,
to an
Claudia
award of
Matthias,
compensatory and
and Claudia
consequential
Williams
damages.
have been associated
All
with her.
other similarly situated
Intriguingly,
employees are
she
also
seems to have
entitled to
replicated the
damages in the
identity
form
of
of
Williams Claudia
uncompensated overtime
Cecile,
wages,
a relative of
liquidated
Sherilyn
damages,
Williams, a former
attorneys'
RN of
fees,
Harry's
and
Home
other
Care.
damages so
This
as to
assumed
preclude
identity even
employers'
extends to
unjust
duplicating a
enrichment.
license
Pursuant
number.
to Section 216b,
Such deceptive
attached
tactics
hereto and
suggest a
filed with this
well-orchestrated
complaint
scheme,
as exhibits
potentially
A through
facilitated
late,
by
the
a
consent
private
to
attorney,
become party
Mr.
nurses
Jonathan
executed
Bernstein.
by each nurse.
Interstate
According
activities.
to the Fair Labor Standard
Claudia's
Act,
alleged residences
1938,
span
a
5
lawsuit shall
states:
be brought
Florida,
against employers
Georgia,
under the
New York,
FLSA Act.
Maryland,
However,
and
per
South
requirements
Carolina.
are set in order to enforce
Given
Section
that she lacks
29
valid
USC
identification, it's
216b.
plausible that she has
The section
assumed
provides
someone
a clear
else's
direction
identity.
to the parties involved in the enforcement
Furthermore,
of 216b.
her lack of New York State
Any
residency
employer who
suggests
violates
she
the
doesn't
provisions of
possess
Section
legitimate
206
citizenship
or Section
papers.
207 of this title
Other
shall be
alarming
liable to the
indicators.
employee
Claudia's
or employer